Dickie Dread, New Age Travellers, A History, 1960 to 1990. Chapter 1, Foundations. Early Subcultures. The hippie movement didn't fall out of the sky in a cloud of patchouli and promise. It crawled up slowly, stubbornly, through the cracks in post-war conformity, part rebellion, part necessity, part dream, part fucking mess. It didn't arrive with a manifesto, it arrived with a question. Is this all there is? The 1950s had laid down the law in concrete and net curtains. Button up, keep quiet, marry early, get a mortgage, watch the telly, pay your taxis, don't ask questions. It was an age of ration books giving way to supermarkets, of national pride covering up emotional silence. Men wore grey suits, smoked furiously and never cried. Women vanished into kitchens and called it fulfillment. Sex was secret. Therapy was shame. Everything was meant to be fine. But beneath the surface, a generation was getting restless. Children raised in the rubble of the Blitz came of age to find there was no new world waiting for them, just jobs in factories, marriages of convenience, and war stories that weren't theirs. School felt pointless. Church rang hollow. The Crown and Parliament spoke in languages no one on the estate recognised. They didn't want to die in suits and frocks. Whispers of change came from across the Atlantic, in the wild sax of jazz, in the beat of American rock and roll, in paperbacks filled with poetry and paranoia. Kids in Liverpool, London and Leeds were tuning their radio stations to private stations and feeling the crackle of something bigger than them. It wasn't revolution yet, it was a mood, a murmur, a sense that the story they'd been handed was missing gaps. Jazz was the rebel uncle of the whole family. Long before rock swaggered onto the stage, jazz had already done the hard yards of transgression. Born in the margins of black America, in bars, brothels, churches and juke joints, it was music for improvisation, resistance and deep emotional honesty. Every solo was a refusal, every wrong note was a decision. In Britain, it started an import culture. In the early 1940s and 1950s, trad jazz and bebop took hold in smoky basements. Ronnie Scott's The Flamingo, The 100 Club. White kids in duffel coats and roll necks crammed up into upstairs rooms to hear raw interpretation of Coltrane, Mingus, Ornette Coleman and Cannonball Adderley. They mimicked their phrasing. They learned the lingo. They passed around joints and copies of downbeat. Drugs were part of the landscape. In the US, heroin had swept through the jazz world in the 1940s and 1950s, taking Charlie Parker, Art Pepper, Chet Baker and dozens more into dark spirals. Songs like Green Dolphin Street, Straight, No Chaser or Round Midnight carried hidden meanings. It wasn't just about romance, it was about fix and frenzy. In the UK scene, weed was standard, speed was common, and heroin lurked in the corners. Jazz musicians knew how to stretch time, both in solos and in the fugue of chemical sleep. As the 1960s cracked open, free jazz resonated with the anarchists and experimentalists. The music was chaotic, unstructured, defiant. It mirrored the times. Some of it fed directly into the hippie movement. Bands like Soft Machine, the Third Ear band, blended jazz with psychedelia, creating wild exploratory landscapes. Early Pink Floyd, pre-Dark Side, channeled jazz into their freakouts at UFO Club, with Syd Barrett treating guitar like a bass. Others stuck closer to the roots, tracing the blues trail from Leadbelly and Howlin' Wolf through John Mayall, Cream, and finally to the wild blues hammering of Led Zeppelin. The line from Robert Johnson to Jimmy Page was a straight one, bent only by distortion pedals and stolen riffs. Jazz was never just music. It was method. It was freedom. It taught the counterculture that structure could be shattered and rebuilt on the fly, and that improvisation was political. The Rolling Stones and Beatles weren't just bands, they were mood swings for a generation. Beatles went from mop-top mischief to LSD mysticism and tape loops. The Stones went darker, blues, drugs, chaos, Altamont. Songs like Street Fighting Man and Gimme Shelter didn't just narrate the unrest, they lived in it. Their style mattered too. The Beatles in Indian cotton, bare feet on Abbey Road. The Stones in velvet, eyeliner, and jagged teeth. They showed people you could be dangerous and dressed. But more than just sonic evolution, they reshaped youth identity. The Beatles sparked a wave of creativity and questioning, inspiring young people to challenge social norms and embrace experimental ideas. Their latest psychedelic phase echoed through student protests and flower power movements. The Stones, on the other hand, became icons for the rebellious outsider. Their sound and swagger fed the rise of countercultures like punk, glam, and grunge. They didn't just soundtrack the 1960s and 70s, they helped birth a generation of youth who saw music as a tool for self-definition, resistance, and belonging. Their legacy carved out space for alternative groups to thrive, in music, in fashion, and in the very idea of what it meant to grow up different. The death of John Lennon in 1980 sent shockwaves through the world, marking the end of an era for millions. More than just a former Beatle, Lennon had become a symbol of peace, rebellion, and artistic freedom. His murder silenced a voice that had inspired a generation to think differently, love louder, and question authority. For many, his death felt like the loss of hope itself, a brutal reminder that even icons of peace aren't safe from violence. By the early 1960s, the cracks widened. Coffee bars replaced tea shops. Guitars replaced hymnals. People lit up, dropped out, and began searching, not just for better wages or more sex, but for meaning, for community, for something that would make sense in a world that only made demands. The hippie scene was born in that hunger, that refusal to carry on as before. It wasn't about being cool, it was about being free. It started with the Beats in America, Ginsberg, Kerouac, Burroughs, roaming the highways, knocking out poems, chasing jazz, chasing meaning. They weren't just scribblers in cafes, they were detonators. Post-war America was buttoned up, paranoid, and obsessed with nuclear families and nukes of the other kind. The Beats cracked the shell. They wrote about drugs, sex, madness, blackness, Buddhism, queerness, America's belly. Ginsberg's Howl and Other Poems was banned for obscenity. Burroughs shot his wife. Kerouac wandered like a monk with a bottle. They didn't want your job or your church. They wanted the road, the void, and a good sax solo at 3 a.m. Their ideas spread across campus readings, underground presses, jazz clubs, and coffee houses. The CIA was running LSD experiments under MKUltra, a secret program that experimented with mind control techniques, including drug use, on unwitting subjects during the Cold War, while kids in Greenwich Village and North Beach were dropping acid to find God. When psilocybin and mescaline hit, the doors flew open. LSD moved from the lab to commune. Timothy Leary told students to tune in, turn on, tune in, and drop out. Kesey took it literally. His merry pranksters painted a school bus and drove it coast to coast, handing out acid like it was communion. San Francisco became a psychic lighthouse for the global counterculture. Haight-Ashbury filled with drifters, artists, acid heads, runaways, and would-be prophets. Communes bloomed like wildflowers. Local rock bands like Jefferson Airplane and Grateful Dead scored the trip. Hendrix lit guitars on fire and made them scream. Janis Joplin tore the roof off the Fillmore with raw heartbreak. And all the while, thousands of kids poured into the Haight, looking for truth, freedom, or just a place to crash. They found community in chaos. Free clinics, diggers handing out food, cops tightening their grip. By the 1967 Summer of Love, the myth was global, but so was the burnout. Fashion marked the lines. Hippies wore flared jeans, Afghan coats, embroidered waistcoats, and patched canvas bags. A woven bracelet said more than a Rolex. Symbols were stitched in. Peace signs, suns, eyes, mushrooms. They were supposed to look like you didn't care, but everyone cared deeply. Drugs shaped the vision and the paranoia. LSD wasn't just a high, it was a new script for reality. It rewired senses, challenged identities, collapsed egos. For many it was the chemical key to the spiritual door. But it also scared the hell out of authorities. The scene pulsed with friction, old and new, radical and routine, fight and flight. But the music pulled it all together. Music didn't just soundtrack this rebellion, it was the rebellion. It shaped how people walked, dressed, spoke, and thought. Before the Parkers and Scooters, there were the Teddy Boys, Britain's first proper youth culture. They stormed out the 1950s with a look that made no sense to their parents, total sense to each other. The Teds took upper-class Edwardian tailoring, velvet collars, draped jackets, bootlace ties, and stitched it onto working-class swagger. They added brothel creepers, drain pipes, and gravity-defying quiffs. Then took it to the dance halls and side streets of post-war Britain. They weren't just dressing up, they were kicking out against austerity, boredom, and invisibility. Rock and roll had arrived from America, and the Teds were its first British disciples. They moved to the sounds of Gene Vincent, Chuck Berry, Bill Haley. There were brawls, gang fights, moral panics. Newspaper headlines screamed about teenage terror, but there was also a kind of raw dignity to all. These were kids who'd grown up in bomb sites and ration queues, now demanding sound, style, and fucking attention. Teds laid the foundation for what came next, the idea that fashion could be protest, that music could be tribal, that street presence was power, that violence and energy left a mark, sometimes on each other, sometimes on history. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, there were the beatniks, black-clad, book-carrying, jazz-loving outsiders who sat cross-legged in basement cafes quoting Ginsberg and sipping espresso. A British version of the beat scene emerged in the late 1950s, orbed in jazz clubs, poetry readings and avant-garde art. They wore Rolex, berets, corduroys and sandals. They read Camus and Kerouac. They were more passive than political, alienated rather than angry, but they opened up space to be strange, to be intellectual outside of institutions, to reject the 9 to 5. Where beatniks turned inward, the Teddy Boys turned outward. Cocky, loud, physical. If the beats brooded, the Teds brawled. Together they defied two poles of disobedient youth in post-war Britain, the thinker and the fighter, the poet and the peacock. While many early beats and hippies dropped out in the UK and the US, some set their sights further afield, chasing not just escape but revelation. Morocco, with its hashish trails, Sufi music and cheap lodgings, became a magnet. Tangier's Medina echoed with the mutterings of exiled poets and acid mystics. William Burroughs spent years there, high and haunted, weaving cut-up novels and chasing inner phantoms. Others followed in his footsteps, not to write, but to loosen the grip of Western normality, living on bread, fruit, kif, and a sense of something ancient just out of reach. The cheapness of life, the warmth, the disinterest of local authorities, it all made North Africa feel like a frontier where borders of mind and state dissolved. Early East, some set off towards India, hitchhiking through Europe, Istanbul, Tehran, Kabul, what became known as the hippie trail. They weren't just looking for a new soundtrack, but a new soul. Ashrams, chai stalls, temple festivals. These weren't holidays, they were tests. People slept on temple steps, read the Bhagavad Gita under trees, and traded boots for beads. And then there were the Israeli kibbutzim, communal farms that offered structure without authority. British dropouts could live collectively, share tools, dig earth and rebuild a sense of purpose without bosses or bills. It wasn't utopia. For many it was the first time they felt free and useful. These travels stitched global colour into the fabric of the early counterculture. And when those travellers came home, they brought with them sounds, fabric, philosophies and drugs that would soon reshape youth culture completely. It was the mods who took pieces of the Teddy Boys and the beats and made it into something sharper. Something that moved, something that danced. The mods were around from the late 1950s to around 1966, so they coincided with the hippie scene. They saw a revival in the late 1970s, mainly due to a quadrophenia, which often merged with the skinhead and scar scenes. We'll cover that later. Clean cuts, narrow trousers, thin lapels and polished shoes. Their scooters gleamed, Vespers and Lambrettas polished like chrome altars, loaded with mirrors, badges and twin headlights. Riding wasn't just transport, it was pageantry. They glided through grey streets like moving style statements, parked up at cafes and clubs in formation, turned every club into a catwalk. Their records spun sharp soul, The Who, Small Faces, The Kinks, Georgie Fame, and imported American 45s from Motown, Stax and Atlantic. Northern soul would come later, but this was its DNA. Tight grooves, urgent vocals, music built for sharp moves and sharper looks. Every beat was dressed to kill. The early mods were working class youth refusing to disappear into soot and silence. They weren't interested in union halls or Sunday roasts. They were into pills, dancing, French cinema and Italian cuts. They dressed like jazz musicians, took blues and black bombers to stay up for 3 days and slept on each other's floors, if at all. They spent money they didn't have on clothes that would outlast any job. And they fought. The rockers, with their leathers, greased hair and battered Nortons, stood for old school rebellion, raw, mechanical, beer-fueled. Mods called them cavemen, rockers called them puffs. It was tribal, territorial, and came to a head in the famous clashes of the 1964 Brighton, Margate, Clacton. Seaside towns turned into battlegrounds. Deck chairs were weaponised. Police lines were drawn on the sand. Front pages shrieked, "Youth riot on beach!" Parliament tutted. Britain panicked. But the mods didn't care. Their uniform was defiance, sharp lines, clean swagger, a glare behind the sunglasses. They weren't just dressing up, they were dressing out. At this point of the story, I should really chart the lead up and explosion on the punk scene. But punk was so crucial to the traveller scene, I'm going to cover its history and relevance in Chapter 2. The New Romantic, also called the Blitz Kids by those who were more partial to more esoteric electronic music, phase emerged in the late 1970s and early 1980s as a flamboyant, fashion-driven subculture rooted in post-punk Britain, particularly in London. Clubs like the Blitz, bands like Visage, Spandau Ballet, Depeche Mode, Duran Duran and Japan typified the movement. All synth-heavy, visually dramatic and steeped in theatrical androgyny and escapist glamour. While at first glance the New Romantics appeared to be the aesthetic opposite of hippies, prioritised slickness over scruffiness, glamour over earthiness, there were subtle crossovers, spirituality and fantasy. Both scenes flirted with myth, symbolism and non-Western aesthetics, think pyramids, runes and Eastern mysticism. They rejected norms. Like the hippies, New Romantics rejected mainstream culture, but through high fashion and artifice instead of naturalism and psychedelia. Also, many early New Romantics, like punks and hippies before them, made their own clothes, staged their own nights and lived communally in squats or shared housing. In essence, while they rarely shared the same spaces, both movements were youthful refusals of a grey, conformist Britain. The hippies threw back to the land idealism, New Romantics through urban fantasy and performance. The goth subculture also emerged in the late 1970s and early 1980s, growing out the post-punk scene in the UK. Took the darker, more introspective elements of punk and fused them with melancholic aesthetics, Victorian imagery and themes of romanticism, decay and alienation. Key bands that laid the groundwork included Susie and the Banshees, Joy Division, Bauhaus, famously with Bela Lugosi's Dead, The Cure, especially their early albums, and the Sisters of Mercy. Visually, goths favoured black clothing, lace leather, fishnets, military surplice and theatrical makeup. Part morning dress, part glam, part horror film. While the goths and hippies were generally separate scenes, there was some overlap at the fringes. Both embraced non-conformity, DIY ethics and alternative spirituality. Goths often explored occult, pagan or existential ideas. At free festivals, especially in the late 1980s, the early 1990s, you'd often find goths turning up at the Traveller Cruise, blending in with punks and psychonauts in the chaos of Stonehenge or Castle Morton. Both goths in squats sometimes shared scenes, and anarcho-punks and travellers, especially in urban centres like Bristol, Brighton and Camden. So while goths weren't hippies, both subcultures pushed back against Thatcherite materialism, sought meaning in the margins, and carved out creative identities in an era of stark binaries. At their best, they even danced in the same fields. Mods gave birth to skinheads, who took the rude boy influence from Jamaica and immigrants and built something new, aggressive, stylish, and street level. Braces, rolled jeans, Ben Shermans, Dr. Martens, cropped hair, cropped speech. They danced to ska, rocksteady, smoked weed, scrapped, worked, drank. Early skinhead culture was multiracial and anti-establishment. But by the late 1970s, the scene split. Some skin lead into racist politics, joining the National Front or patrolling estates. Others doubled down on solidarity, marching with the anti-Nazi League or running with the two-tone scene. The boots stayed the same. It was where they marched that mattered. Long before the sound system shook stadiums and dub made it to the record shops, the heart of Jamaican music in England beat loudest in the back rooms and basements of terraced houses. These were the blues dances, underground sessions thrown in cramped flats, smoky cellars and upstairs rooms in Brixton, Handsworth, Harlesden and beyond. You could not find them advertised. You heard about them through word of mouth, from a cousin, a brethren at the shebeen, or a man selling patties down the market. Pound on the door, wait for the eye through the gap, then step into a world thick of ganja smoke, bass lines and bodies swaying shoulder to shoulder. The walls would sweat with condensation and sound. Home-built speaker boxes stacked like altars in the corner, powered by amps soldered together in someone's kitchen. Names like Duke Vin, Count Shelley, Coxzone Outer National and Quaker City ruled the scene. Dropping ska, rocksteady, early reggae, records straight out of Kingston, hot off the boat. It was more music. It was more than music. It was resistance, a space to be seen, to be proud, to drown out the cold streets and racist stares with sweet rhythm and deep roots. Men in sharp suits and trilbies, women in bright headscarves and heels, skanking, laughing, holding tight through the night until the dawn crept in. In those dark, crowded rooms, the first generation of the Windrush children carved out a space with sound, laying the foundation for lovers rock, jungle, grime and beyond. The blues dance was not just a party, it was a home. Ska came roaring out of Jamaica in the early 1960s, a bright, bouncing fusion of Caribbean mento, American R&B and calypso, built around walking bass lines and offbeat guitar chops. It travelled with the Windrush generation to cities like London, Birmingham and Coventry, where it struck a chord with black British youth and increasingly rebellious white kids too. By the late 1970s, ska had been reborn in the UK through the two-tone movement, with bands like the Specials, Selector, The Beat, UB40 and Madness leading the charge. The second wave was fast, political and fiercely anti-racist, blending ska's rhythm with punk's edge. It wasn't just music, it was a statement against the National Front, against Thatcherite division, against boredom itself. The energy of ska later spilled into the traveller scene through this cultural cross-pollination. Punk squatters and free festival crews adopted Two Stones' DIY attitude, its style and its message. Ska's upbeat rhythm made it to a festival favourite, especially in the early days of Stonehenge and Deeply Vale, where selector vans and sound systems became part of the soundtrack. For many young travellers, ska was a gateway into Jamaican music and anti-racist politics, danceable protest, symbol of hybrid identity. Crucially, it played just as well in a muddy field as a council flat, making it a key part of musical DNA of the road. Note that ska is still a vibrant sound at today's traveller-run festivals, led by Culture Shock, who I first saw playing at Cholderton Woods, see Chapter 4, and now bands like the Sporadics, Mad Dog Collective, Inner Terrestrials, and many others mix ska and punk into a seductive dance-inducing rhythmic mix. It's also my favourite music to play out and as I DJ, and guaranteed to get the older crusties on their feet. Further north in Wigan, Stoke, Blackpool and beyond, the northern soul scene took shape. Obsessive, ecstatic, underground. It wasn't about fame or money. It was about rare records and raw dedication. Kids from factory towns and mining estates dug through American import bins of obscure up-tempo soul singles, the ones that never charted, the ones that sounded like heartbreak sped up. They danced for hours in patched trousers, sweat-darkened vests, baggy shirts and sports badges sewn onto everything. The dance floors, especially at Wigan Casino, Twisted Wheel in Manchester and Blackpool Mecca were sanctuaries of motion. Dancers spun, stomped, dropped, shuffled. Amphetamines were everywhere. Blues, black bombers, purple hearts, handed over in pub toilets and venue car parks. They kept the rhythm in your bones and the lights on behind your eyes. Jaw clenched, knees loosed, heart thumping like a snare drum. You didn't just like Neufchâtel, you lived it. You travelled miles by coach to make all-nighters. You learned the steps. You carried talcum powder in your pocket for the floor. You got judged on your record collection, your stamina, your passion. Tapes were swapped like sacred relics. A rare 45 could earn more respect than a punch. But outside those walls, public opinion was less romantic. The mainstream press painted the scene as druggy, delinquent and out of control. Small town councils tried to shut down events. Police raided venues under suspicion of pill dealing. Parents worried about soul cults and amphetamine crazes. Doctors warned of heart failure and collapsed teens. But the truth was more complex. This was working class escapism, a beautiful, precise rebellion against monotony, against poverty, against being told to behave. There was no money in it. That was not the point. It was about transcendence, and nobody needed to sell that. While some danced, others rode. The biker gangs, Ton-Up Boys, Hells Angels, road rats without maps, were a parallel universe of rebellion. Leather jackets, chain wallets, back patches, iron crosses, Triumphs, BSAs and Nortons. Their code was loyalty, speed and suspicion of everything mainstream. Some were violent, some just wanted the road. Festivals would come to know them as security, troublemakers, or both. They brought discipline and chaos. They carried knives and stories. Not everyone lived in cities. Not everyone stayed put. But the vans and buses of the New Age travellers, before the vans and buses of the New Age travellers, there were the Romani and Irish traveller communities, Britain's original nomads. They'd been moving across these islands for hundreds of years, long before squatting had a name. Horse-drawn wagons, hand-built caravans, scrap metal, fruit picking. They were skilled, resourceful, proud, and relentlessly harassed. Councils blocked them, police moved them on. The Caravan Sites Act 1968 was supposed to guarantee stopping places. It didn't. Instead, it set the stage for more evictions, more prejudice, and more myths. When Krusty's next punks started converting vans in the 1970s, they were seen as something new, but the roads they rolled down had been worn in by the centuries of movement and marginalisation. Sometimes the new and old traveller worlds clash, class, culture, history, but sometimes they shared fences, tools and cups of tea.